Hello, friend. I'm so glad that you have joined me today. We are going to be looking at two of the most important words you will ever hear in your life. These are two words that can change everything. They're two words that you need to hear, two words that are woven throughout some of the most amazing stories in all of the Bible. So if you have a Bible, grab it. We're going to get into the Word together and look at those two words.
Welkom bij Antwoorden met Bayless Conley. Het leven kan soms een uitdaging zijn. Maar of het nu gaat om financiën, relaties, gezondheid of de vraag naar je doel in je leven, één ding is zeker. God ziet je. Hij houdt van je. En wat er ook aan de hand is, hij heeft de antwoorden op je vragen.
Vandaag zijn we in het kantoor van Cottonwood Church. Onze nieuwe tv-studio is nog in aanbouw. Intussen blijven wij Gods Woord brengen om u te inspireren tot hoop en geloof. Hier is Bayless.
Hello, and we're going to open up with a bit of a story from Acts chapter 7, talking about Joseph. And I think most people, Christian, non-Christian, are familiar with the story of Joseph in Egypt. But there's something really quite profound here that I want you to hear. This is from Acts chapter 7, beginning in verse 9. It said, "And the patriarchs, becoming envious, sold Joseph into Egypt, but God was with him, and delivered him out of all of his troubles, and gave him favor and wisdom in the presence of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and made him governor over Egypt and all his house." There's two words here that I want you to see, two words that I want you to grab a hold of, and they're this, in verse 9, but God. Two of the most important words you will ever hear. But God was with him. Joseph was hated by his brothers, who because of envy threw him into a pit and then sold him to slave traders. He's taken off to a foreign land. You know, I'm sure his hands were bound. They're shouting at him in a language he doesn't know. Perhaps he's being whipped. He's sold on the auction block in Egypt. A man named Potiphar buys him. Understand, he's a kid. He's a young teenager. He doesn't understand the language. He doesn't know the culture. He's been separated from everyone and everything that he knows and that he loves. He's been betrayed by his own family. And then in Egypt, you know the story. You know, he starts working for Potiphar. Potiphar's wife takes a shine to him and tries to get Joseph to sleep with her. But he's got so much integrity, he won't do it. He's not going to sin against God. And he's not going to sin against, you know, the master of the house, Potiphar. And so, you know, the wife is scorned by Joseph or shunned by him. He's not going to sleep with her. She grabs his coat, tries to forcibly make the young man get in bed with her. And he runs off and leaves her coat there in her hands. And so she uses that and she forges a lie. Her husband comes home and says, "Oh, this Hebrew boy you brought, you know, to live with us and to work in our home, he tried to rape me, and here's the proof. I've got his coat." So Potiphar is incensed, has Joseph thrown into prison. And we know the story. He interprets the butler's dreams. He interprets the baker's dreams. They come to pass exactly. And the butler promises that when he's released from prison and restored back to his place with Pharaoh, that he's going to remember Joseph and talk to Pharaoh about Joseph and get Joseph out of prison. But of course, the butler forgets. And Joseph is in that Egyptian prison for several years. He's had nothing but a hard way to go, thrown into circumstances beyond his control. And then we find those two beautiful words, but God. Those two words that can change everything. Those two words that can turn impossibilities into possibilities. Those two words that made all of the difference in Joseph's life, but God. But God was with him. The odds were against him, but God. His dreams could never come to pass, but God. God delivered him out of all of his troubles, gave him favor, gave him wisdom, and took him from the bottom and put him on the top. And friend, that might be your story right now. You know, that everything has gone wrong for you, that the rug has been, pulled out from underneath you. But may you, like Joseph, towards the end of the story, after his father dies and he's gathered with his brothers, this is in Genesis chapter 50. His brothers are afraid that now that daddy's out of the way, that Joseph's going to take revenge on them. And he says, look, don't be afraid. And these are his words in Genesis 50. He says, you meant it for evil against me, but God. You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good in order to bring it about as it is this day, to save many people alive. What the devil and his crowd mean for evil, God can turn it around for good. And as you sit and listen to me today, perhaps you've been betrayed by someone that you trusted. In fact, it may have been the person that should have protected you, turned out to be your violator or your betrayer. Maybe you've been thrown into circumstances beyond your control. Maybe your whole world has been shattered. And everything that at one time, you thought were stabilizing factors in your life, they've all been removed. And things for you right now, listen, I don't say this lightly, because I know there are some people watching me. You are suffering greatly right now. You are in an emotional crisis right now. Circumstances are looming so huge on the horizon, you see no way out. In fact, there may be somebody watching me. You thought, I may as well just take my own life. The world would be better off without me. I've got no hope. There's no light. I'm telling you, there is light. It might be hopeless except for these two words, but God. You take God out of the equation and things are hopeless, but you factor him in and all things are possible. I actually hear fairly often from people in our church, Pastor, you have no idea how much God has done in my life in the last 6 months, or how much God has done in my life in the last year. To literally, if you saw them, you wouldn't even equate them with the person that they were 6 months or a year before. My friend, God can do it for you. If you, like Joseph, don't allow your circumstances to turn your life bitter, but if you'll keep your eyes on God, continue looking to him, even if for a season it doesn't seem like he's working at all. I'm sure it may have seemed that way to Joseph. God had given him the dream, of the sheaves bowing down to his sheaf, showing that his brothers were going to serve him, and that the sun, moon, and 11 stars bowed down, that even his parents, in a sense, would be under his authority. And God had given him these dreams that he would be in this position of prominence and authority. And it seemed like everything that happened to him took him farther and farther and farther away from the dreams. When his brothers threw him in the pit, he's farther away from the dream. When they sell him to the slave traders, he's farther away from the dream. When they sell him on the auction block in Potiphar's house, he's farther away from the dream. When Potiphar's wife lies about him, he's thrown in prison, farther away from the dream. When the Pharaoh's butler forgets about him, he spends years in prison, farther away from the dream. How can it ever come to pass? And then Pharaoh, of course, had his dream. No one could interpret it, and the butler remembered, says, I remember this day my sin. There's this Hebrew kid in jail, and he can interpret dreams. And in one moment, Joseph went from the prison to the palace. God turned everything around and literally saved many people in the known world through him interpreting Pharaoh's dream and giving Pharaoh the insight and the instruction of what he needed to do to prepare for the coming famine. And friend, it may seem like the dream that you had, maybe even as a child, maybe all you ever wanted was to be happy and to have kids and raise a family, and you just kind of saw yourself, and it's like everything that has happened, the betrayals and the disappointments, and you're farther and farther and farther away, or you saw yourself succeeding in business or whatever it might be. And it's just like life has taken you, put you in a headlock, thrown you to the ground, and stomped you. Well, friend, I just want to tell you, it's not over. I think there's a but God for you. I don't think it's a coincidence that you're listening to me right now. There's a God in heaven who knows your name. And you might say, Bayless, stop it. You're just trying to get my hopes up. Yes, I am. I am trying to get your hopes up. I plead guilty to that. God loves you, my friend. He has not forsaken you, and He wants to help you. And I want to encourage you, keep listening to me, because faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the Word of God. We come to another story in Genesis 31, and Jacob has been working for his uncle Laban. He has married Laban's two daughters, Rachel and Leah. And the story opens up that we're going to read in Genesis 31, verse 4. It says, "So Jacob sent and called Rachel and Leah to the field, to his flock, and said to them, I see your father's countenance, that it is not favorable toward me as before, but the God of my father has been with me. And you know that with all my might I've served your father. Yet your father has deceived me and changed my wages 10 times. But God did not allow him to hurt me." Jacob had been swindled, cheated, and treated unfairly. And if you read the story, you think, oh my. You know, Rachel and Leah's dad, Laban, he was a bad man. You know, he was a swindler. He was a liar. He was a deceiver. And Jacob was the one that was at the raw end of that deal and all of those things that Laban did. But he said, but God did not allow him to hurt me. You may be in similar circumstances today, a situation where you've been treated unfairly at work. Maybe you've been passed over for promotion. You're overworked and underpaid. Maybe you've been led astray, deceived in some sort of a business deal. You've lost a lot of money, and things would look bleak if not for 2 words, but God. Jacob said, but God did not allow him to hurt me. And God prospered Jacob despite the fact that Laban tried repeatedly over a protracted period of time to cheat him. There's a couple of important things that I think we need to consider as we reflect on this but God story. First, God didn't turn Jacob's situation around overnight. It was through a process that he went through over a number of years. And most of the time, it's going to be a process with us. And you need to be willing to stick with God over the long haul and not quit. You know, I had a friend when I was in college, and he told me an interesting story. Now, if you're watching from another country right now, you may not understand the significance of this story, but I will try and relate it to you. He told me his father or his grandfather had been in a bread-making business with another man. And the other man had this great vision, you know, that their little bread company, you know, was going to go national and big things were going to happen. And it just was kind of slow in coming. And my friend said, you know, my grandfather just got frustrated. He said, oh, this is taking too long. And so he went to his business partner, the other man that was in this little, you know, bread manufacturing business. He said, look, I want out. This is taking too long. And the other guy said, are you sure? You know, I really believe that this thing is going to go big. He said, no, I want out. This is taking too long. I want you to buy me out now. So his partner bought him out. And my friend's grandfather, and my friend, interestingly enough, and this was sort of what our conversation was couched in, he was hurting financially. He was your typical, you know, starving college student. You know, didn't have much funds. His family didn't have much money. And his grandfather had been in business with a bread maker named Langendorf. Now, that name may not mean much to you. In fact, if you're probably not even my age and you're living here in the United States, you may not even recognize it. But the Langendorf Bread Company at one time when I was a kid was enormous. You saw their bread trucks, you know, virtually driving down every street, you know, in the United States. They had huge factories that were filled with these machines that made 7,000 loaves of bread a minute. They literally made millions of loaves of bread every day. They were a household name. And if you actually look at the statistics, when they were in their heyday before the family sold the business, they were as large as the largest car manufacturers in the United States. They had the same revenues that the largest steel industries had in the United States. And I think about my friend who was struggling in college. How do I get the tuition paid? I may not be able to eat dinner tonight. It's because his grandfather just wasn't willing to stick in there a little bit longer. And my friend, you just need to be willing to stay with God. I love it when things happen in a moment of time. And we talked about Joseph and his story, that in one day everything turned around. Yet there were years in there where he stayed faithful to God, refused to become bitter, but kept trusting God, kept his heart close to God. And so that's the first thing. We need to be willing to stick with God. You need to be willing to stay in there, because I'm telling you, frankly, your story is not done yet. But there was a second thing in this story that is oh so important. As Jacob relates the story to his wives, this is before they left, and he says, hey, but God didn't allow your father to harm me. He went on and told his wives and related to them the plan that God gave to him to turn things around, and how God did, in fact, over a period of years, turn things around, and how he had prospered Jacob. And then he says in connection with it, the last thing he says to his wives, that God said to me, I am the God of Bethel, where you anointed the pillar and made a vow to me. So as Jacob relates this but God in his life, as he relates how God turned the tables and prospered him and took him from the bottom to the top, he places in the middle of it this thought and vocalizes how he had made a vow to God. That was an important factor in God turning things around. And we read about the vow that he made. Now he's left his father's house, and the only thing he possesses, this is the only thing, he has a stick. He has a staff. He has nothing else other than the staff. He's even sleeping with a stone under his head. That's his pillow. Friend, things are rough when you have to use a rock for a pillow. And in this state, when he's going, and he hasn't arrived at Laban's house yet, but he makes this vow, and I want to read to you from Genesis 28. It says, then Jacob rose early in the morning and took the stone that he had put at his head, set it up as a pillar, and poured oil on top of it. And he called the name of that place Bethel, but the name of the city had been Luz previously. Then Jacob made a vow. Are you listening? Then Jacob made a vow saying, if God will be with me and keep me in this way that I'm going, and give me bread to eat and clothing to put on, so that I come back to my father's house in peace, then the Lord shall be my God. And this stone which I have set as a pillar shall be God's house, and of all that you give me, I will surely give a tenth to you. Now, he said, if God brings me back in peace, the Hebrew word for peace, it's not just a matter of tranquility. It's a word that encompasses our whole being, spirit, soul, and body, all the things that contribute to our peace. Having our needs met, being out of the middle of a storm. That's the Hebrew word for peace. It encompasses spirit, soul, and body. In fact, some places in the Bible is translated as prosperity. But here's the vow he made. He said, God, of everything you give me. And notice, he's making this vow to God. All he has, his sole possession in life is a stick. God, of everything you give me, I'll give the first tenth to you. In Proverbs 3, it says to honor the Lord with your substance and with the first part of all your income, so your barns will be filled with plenty. And Jacob vowed to God to be a tither, to give God. And a tithe just means a tenth. But God, of everything you give me, I'm going to give the first tenth back to you. And he made that vow and he began to practice it, not just when things started looking up, but when things were looking their worst. For the 20 years he was with Laban, he tithed. He honored God and gave God the first part of everything that God gave him. He showed that God was first in his life by giving God his first and his best. And you know, when he goes back to his father's house, after he leaves with his wives, he's not just a single person with, 2 wives on camels. He crosses over the Jordan and he says to God, God says, when I crossed over the Jordan the first time, all I had was a stick in my hand. But now you've made me 2 companies. He had household servants. He had flocks. He had herds. He was a wealthy man. He was an influential man. He was a blessed man. And part of the reason is because he honored God with the first part of his income all the way through. And you need to determine to do the first thing, my friend. You may not have much at all right now, but you need to honor God with the little that you have. There's a gentleman that I know. I've met him. I don't know him, and he wouldn't know my name, I don't think. But I remember him sharing a story, and he's part Native American. And he used to go on some of the Native American reservations and preach in the reservation churches. And if you know the story of the American Indians, of our Native Americans here, basically every treaty that was made with them was broken, on the side of the U.S. government, not on their side, but on the side of the U.S. government. And they were, put on these reservations, and there has been, in some cases, just extreme problems with poverty and alcoholism on these reservations. And the man, as he related this story, he's going to preach in reservation churches. He said there was generally this cloud of depression. Everywhere you went, they battled with poverty, battled with alcoholism. But he said on one reservation, when he went to the church, he said it was so different. He said there was just an attitude of victory there. There was an attitude of joy there. The church wasn't broken down. It was in good shape. It was well taken care of. It was clean. And there was, a whole bunch of new cars parked outside. And he said generally, that hardly anyone in the congregations had a car. And if they did, it was held together with, a duct tape and baling wire. And he just said it was just so different, the atmosphere and the prosperity and the joy. And he talked to the pastor afterwards, said, I've spoken in a lot of reservation churches, and said, I know that your church is very different. There's prosperity and a joy and a momentum here that I haven't seen anywhere else. Can you tell me why? And he said, without reservation, the pastor says, yes, I can tell you why. He said, when I came to this church, I think it was like 10 years before, and it was just like every other reservation church. The church was dilapidated. I think 1 or 2 people owned a car, and they were kind of broken down. There was this just sort of haze of depression that hung over everything. He said, but I taught the people to tithe. He said, I taught them to honor God with the first part of everything they got. And God's promise, he said, I said to them, God would open up the windows of heaven. This is from Malachi chapter 3 and verse 10. And I'll pour you out such a blessing, you won't have room enough to receive it. He said, our people began to tithe. And he said, many of them, they came, they didn't have anything. So on their way to church in the mornings, they walked the gravel road. They would find the shiniest, most beautiful stone they could find. And they would put that in the offering bucket when the offering bucket came by. He said, some Sunday mornings, all we got for the offering was a bucket full of rocks. But the people from their hearts began to give, from every dollar they gave the first dime, the first 10%, to God's house. He said it didn't happen overnight, but slowly, things began to change in the church to where today, he said almost every member of the congregation owns their own automobile. That depression that hung over the church is not there. We've had a revival on the reservation. He said it all goes back to honoring God with the first part of our income. And my friend, I just want to tell you, there is a but God for you. And if you, like Jacob, have been swindled, have been cheated, you've gotten, as we say here, the short end of the stick. You've been treated unfairly. Well, you look to God because God can turn things around. And I believe there's going to be a but God in your story before everything is finished. But I want to encourage you in this. Make the determination that you're going to be in it for the long haul, that you're going to trust God through thick and thin. He will bring you through. And with whatever God gives you, whether it's little or much, Always honor God with your first and your best. When you do that, it's the outward way that you display that God is first and most important in your life. Jesus said, where our treasure is, there our heart will be also. I pray that this word has blessed you and that you put it into practice. I'm so glad that you joined me for this lesson, and we're certainly not done with it. We have a whole lot more but God's to look at. So you need to join us next time. And if you don't have a Bible, go get yourself one and we'll study the Word together. We have a daily email devotional that I believe can be of great benefit to you. You know, when we take God's Word in every day, it helps us become established in the Lord. The Bible talks about the inward man being renewed day by day. Jesus had to take up our cross daily and to follow Him.
Lees de overdenking op je smartphone, 's ochtends bij de koffie, wanneer je onderweg bent of meteen op je computer.
Take time to sow the seeds of God's Word into your life every day with this free email devotional.
Heb je vragen over de uitzending of houd je iets bezig waarvoor we kunnen bidden? Schrijf ons dan of bel ons op. Ons team is er voor je. Hier vind je nog meer antwoorden op levensvragen. Er is elke dag een nieuwe overdenking van Bayless, die je online kunt lezen of die je per e-mail kunt ontvangen. Als je op de hoogte wilt blijven van de preken, kun je je abonneren op ons kanaal. God zegen.